we do have one additional item on the agenda for this afternoon, which it's also very important. I'm looking at the time, it is 5:25, and I'd like to spend some time. Julia is going to provide us an update on the Recreational Reform Initiative. We're also going to be joined by the policy board of the commission, and I'm looking at the names here. Is Pat Kelleher here, Bob, or are you going to serve as co-chair with me?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Pat Kelleher's not here. He's got a legislative and budgetary conflict up in Maine that he's wrestling with. So I will stand in as your co-chair. Thank you.
Okay. So Bob Beal is going to sit with me as co-chair on this discussion. Julia is going to provide us maybe a 10 or 15 minute overview of actions and work that's been done on the Recreational Reform Initiative. I've also been in discussion with Garfo and with Adam Nowalski about some direction that they would like to provide. I don't necessarily know it needs to be made in the form of a motion, but if we can all get around some of the ideas that they have as far as guidance to the FMAT in moving forward, I think that would be a good accomplishment for today. That way, we not only just receive information today, but we provide the guidance and direction to the FMAT so that we can begin moving this forward. It's been identified as a high priority for both the service and the council and commission in moving forward with these creative ideas on how we reform the recreational fisheries along the East Coast. So with that said, let's go to Julia. Thanks for your patience, Julia. I'm sorry it's taken us so long to get here today, but as I mentioned, sometimes things just take a little longer than planned. But we're looking forward to your presentation on updates. And then after you're done, we'll take questions and answers. And then I'll turn to Mike and Adam for their thoughts, and that'll be the basis for the discussion. So Julia, whenever you're ready, you can start. And welcome to members of the policy board. Thanks for being here today. And again, Bob's going to be co-chair with me. So I'll leave it there and turn to Julia for her presentation.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. I didn't test my audio yet today, so I'm hoping you can all hear me.
Yeah, you sound good, Julia.
Great. So the presentation's only 12 slides. Hopefully it'll be pretty quick. I'm going to cover the first part, and then Savannah Lewis with the commission is going to take over for the second part of it. Let's see. There we go. So the presentation will cover the goal of the Recreational Reform Initiative, some big milestones in terms of progress made to date, and then we're going to focus in on one part of the Recreational Reform Initiative called the Harvest Control Rule, and we'll tell you about some discussions that we've already had as a staff working group in terms of things that we already have started to think about, and then plans for further development of all of those ideas by our FMAT/PDT group that we just got going recently. So just to remind you all, the goal of the Recreational Reform Initiative is to provide more stability in the recreational bag size and season limits from year to year, to provide more flexibility in the management process, and for accessibility to be aligned with availability and stock status. And there's an asterisk next to that last one because it's important to note that the intent is not to circumvent the requirement to constrain catch to the ACL, nor is the intent to change the current method for deriving catch and landings limits as defined in the fishery management plans. And the council and board have been clear on that since 2019. So these are just some big picture progress milestones that have happened in the past few years. So first of all, conversations related to the potential for major changes to recreational fisheries management have been occurring for many years, but the Recreational Reform Initiative really got going at the end of 2018 when the council and the Summer Flounder Scut Black Sea Bass Management Board agreed to form a steering committee of staff and leadership. And that steering committee met throughout 2019 and 2020 and developed the goal statement and provided guidance on topics to pursue. And it was around that time period that there was clarity on the idea that this initiative would focus on all 4 jointly managed recreational fisheries, so summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and bluefish. In October of 2020, the council and the policy board considered everything that had been discussed up until that time and prioritized 9 topics for further development through the Recreational Reform Initiative, and also initiated a framework and addendum and an amendment at that point in time. So kind of saying, these are the things that we really want to work on, and we are initiating a management action to do them. So in February of this year, the council and the policy board talked about it again and agreed to prioritize one of the 9 things, the harvest control rule, as an immediate next step, acknowledging that all 9 topics can't be fully developed at the same time. So since February of this year, we've had the understanding that the harvest control rule is the top priority, at least, for the remainder of this year. So between February and now, an informal staff working group has done a lot of work to more fully develop the harvest control rule concept. And that staff working group has now transitioned to a joint FMAT and PDT. And the plan is for the FMAT and PDT to continue to more fully develop these concepts. So this slide just lists all the 9 topics that are part of the Recreational Reform Initiative, and I'm not going to read them all out loud or get into detail about any of them, except for the harvest control rule. But I just wanted to throw this up here to remind you what all of those 9 things are. It is a defined list, but again, this is too much to do all at the same time. So there's been some discussions of priorities and which to do first, different types of documents to do them in. And again, the harvest control rule is our focus at this point in time, but these other items are still part of management actions that have been initiated. So the plan is to more fully develop these after we've made more progress on the harvest control rule. So what is the harvest control rule? Well, this slide summarizes the conceptual idea of the harvest control rule, and we'll provide more details on some of the specifics in later slides. But the overarching goal is to rely less on expected harvest compared to the recreational harvest limit when setting bag size and season limits for the upcoming year, and instead to use a more holistic approach that places greater emphasis on stock status indicators and trends. The harvest control rule approach would define a range of management measure steps. So this figure here is just an example for illustration purposes, but in the figure, the management measure steps would be A through D. We haven't decided that there will be 4. This is just to illustrate the concept. So each of the steps would have predetermined bag size and season limits, and the step used in a given year would be selected largely based on stock status indicators. And the intent of the original proposal, so this proposal was originally put forward by 6 recreational fishing organizations, but the proposal is going to be modified from what was originally put forward. But part of the intent of the original proposal was that the most liberal measures, so step A in the figure here, are the most liberal measures that anglers feel that they would need, and anything more liberal would not have additional socioeconomic benefits. These measures would be used when the indicators suggest a very healthy stock status. The most restrictive measures, which are step D in this figure, would be used when the indicators suggest poor stock status and would promote conservation of the stocks while providing some amount of access to anglers and helping businesses such as for-hire vessels and bait and tackle shops to stay in business. So stakeholder input is always important when we pick the management measures for any given year, but it's going to be especially important under this approach, and especially for those most and least restrictive measures, because as I described, the least restrictive measures are meant to be the most liberal that anglers feel that they would ever need, and then the most restrictive are the measures that if you go more restrictive than that, it's kind of a threshold of major economic impacts that it's hard to bounce back from. And for both of those things, we don't have data to help us figure out what that is. We need a lot of input from stakeholders to help figure out what might be the appropriate management measures for all of the steps, and especially for the most and least restrictive management measure steps. I also want to note that the council and the board could not commit to a most restrictive set of measures that they would never go beyond. So this would have to be considered as an intention rather than a strict threshold, especially for that most restrictive step. And that is all I had for my part of the presentation. And then Savannah's gonna take over to provide some more details that the working group and FMAT PDT have been talking about.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Julia. I just want to make sure that my audio is coming in clear because I didn't have an opportunity to test it.
Yeah, you sound great, Savannah.
All right, thank you, Mike. So the staff working group has discussed many aspects of the harvest control rule. These topics will be further developed by the FMAT PDT group that is currently underway, and I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the topics that were discussed. The working group put together a series of questions and concepts to serve as a starting point for the PDT and FMAT to begin exploring further. So for you today, I don't have any concrete decisions or directions for the council and board to consider, just a starting point for the FMAT and PDT and an update on where the harvest control rule is at currently. The staff working group recommended that management measures in a given year should be based on multiple stock status indicators. However, further consideration is needed regarding the most appropriate indicators to use. Potential indicators could include biomass compared to the target level, recruitment trends, and harvest. Other data such as environmental trends, socioeconomic information, and/or data on angler behavior can be incorporated into this approach in the future if appropriate data are available to do so. The working group also recommended that the development of a decision tree might be helpful as an approach that can be used to select management measures based on multiple indicators. The working group also discussed that to provide the stability and appropriately use the data, the harvest control rule should have a limited number of steps with clearly defined boundaries between the steps. The appropriate number of steps and the boundaries should be based on data considerations, for example, considerations related to the precision and certainty of the MRIP data. This is a topic that will be further developed by the FMAT and PDT. Oh, next slide, Julia. Oh, sorry. The working group recommended that an empirical method should be used to produce initial management measures for each step, which can then be reviewed by the managers and stakeholders and modified through a model based on their input. The working group did begin the exploration of the use of an existing model developed initially for summer flounder with council funding. The model emulates a fishery response to regulation changes and generates uncertainty around the estimates. A black sea bass version is currently in development. Given timing and workload constraints, a scup or bluefish version of the model is not likely to be developed within the next year. Staff are currently planning for a subgroup of the SSC to peer review this model later this year. And again, the intent is not to require the use of this model for setting measures each year, but to be used as a tool to carry out significant amount of analysis that will be required to further develop the harvest control rule with the FMAT and PDT. This slide shows some of the key topics that the FMAT and PDT will be discussing over the next few months. They include which stock status indicators will be recommended for use, what are the appropriate number of steps, and how do you define the boundaries between the steps, how best can we use the empirical model in conjunction with manager and stakeholder input, can the harvest control rule be used for stocks under a rebuilding plan, how do we modify accountability measures, and how do we appropriately use the data, especially at a state, wave, or mode level. This slide shows a draft timeline for the next steps. It's important to emphasize that all dates are subject to change. After today's meeting and continuing through the end of this year and likely beyond, the FMAT and PDT will continue to further develop the harvest control rule. There will be an assessment peer review for all 4 species at the end of June. This will be important for providing updates on stock status and for informing catch and landing limits for the next 2 years. In July, we will have the SSC, Monitoring Committee, and AP meeting to provide recommendations on catch and landing limits for upcoming years for all 4 species. In August, the Council and Board will adopt catch and landing limits for the next 2 years, and we will provide another update on progress made by the FMAT and PDT on the harvest control rule. We also anticipate that the SSC subgroup peer review of the empirical model that I mentioned earlier will take place in late August, though the exact timing is still to be determined. As we mentioned earlier, stakeholder input will be very important for informing the management measures in the harvest control rule, especially for the most and least restrictive steps. We thought it would be important to more fully develop the harvest control rule before seeking stakeholder input, and are currently envisioning that we would gather stakeholder input through workshops and/or other methods this fall at the earliest. In November, the Monitoring Committee and AP will discuss recreational management measures for 2022. We can provide another update on the harvest control rule in December, with a goal of having a much more fully developed concept by then. In December, the Council and Board will also discuss federal waters recreational management measures for all 4 species for 2022 and plan to take final action on the summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass commercial and recreational allocation amendment. We included these other non-recreational reform topics on the draft agenda here just to provide a sense of the workload constraints and the intersection with other ongoing actions for these species. These will be important considerations related to the time it will take to fully develop the harvest control rule. With that, we're happy to take any questions and open it up for discussion. Again, we don't need any action by the Council and Board today. Our intent was just to provide an update on the topics that the FMAT and PDT will be further developing over the coming months.
All right, thanks, Savannah, and thanks, Julia, for your presentation. And while, as you just mentioned, Savannah, there's no necessary action at this time. I think that there are some folks who would like to provide some guidance. I know that the service has something that they want to present, and maybe not in the form of a motion, but just in form of some guidance as to how to move forward. But before we get there, let's go ahead and let's ask if anyone has any questions at this time. I think that would be the first step. I'm going to go to Joe Cimino, then I have Tom Fody and Dewey Hemmelwright. But you're up first, Joe. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And this is not to put Julia or Savannah on the spot. So this may end up being a question to the PDT FMAT ultimately. In looking at stock status, I know that we've also had, pretty good luck using incoming year classes as a predictor to harvest, at least for sea bass. But I think even to some extent, fluke at the state level with state indices. So is there some way to also provide that guidance with, with this process? If we know there's a strong year class coming into the fishery, that would also color how we manage in the next year.
Hi, Joe. I can provide a little bit of information on that. Ultimately, that will end up being the decision of the PDT and FMAT, but that is something that we are strongly encouraging be considered and something that we will be looking at to build that into this process somewhere.
All right, thanks for that, Savannah. Thanks for the question, Joe. Tom Fody, you're next.
Yeah, I like a lot of the ideas. The only problem I'm having, and my concern is, part of the discussion is the people that show up to meetings, and a lot of them have, like Bluefish, says, well, we need catch and release. But we miss a lot of the community, the subsistence fishermen, the people like fish for, want to take home for fish to eat. And we don't seem to get that population in our hearings. And how are you going to approach that problem that we don't really get representation? How are you going to design stakeholder meetings to include that population, the poor, the subsistence fishermen?
I'll take that one, I guess, Mr. Chair, if that's okay.
Yeah, please just jump in. If you got the answer, just go ahead and chime in.
Sure. I'd say we don't really have the answer. We're going to think harder about how to get input and maybe try to do some non-traditional methods. We can use multiple methods to get input. We can do workshops and written opportunities and other ways of getting input, and definitely open to feedback and suggestions for how to reach those populations that we don't normally interact with. We probably don't even know that the council and commission exist, because this whole thing will work the best if we have, the best understanding of what the recreational community really desires here. And it's probably different groups are going to want different things. Different people in different states are going to want different things. So we're going to need to try to get as much input as possible, but definitely open to suggestions for how to do that.
All right, thanks for that, Julia. Dewey Himmelwright, got you next, and then Eric Reed. Go ahead, Dewey.
Thank you. I'm wondering how the harvest control rule is tied to the status of the stock, but how, and maybe this is coming further in this amendment, but I still don't understand how you're going to constrain catch to a portion of an ACL with the current accounting methodology. So right now you're given a portion of a catch based on you know, kind of the stock, long as it's not overfished and overfishing's not occurring. We just kind of have forgiven the wreck landings. And so how is this going to change different? It's almost like I'm having a hard time understanding that part. And my second thing would be there needs to be this given to the public portioned out sooner than a big document later at the end. Because this is, you know, for me, this wasn't my conceptual idea of recreational reform, but it appears this is the route it's taken. But I don't understand how it's going to be tied into keeping into the portion of allocation that one sector is given. Thank you.
So I'll start to answer that, and Savannah or others or Garfo staff can chime in if more is needed, but you kind of touched on it a little bit. That's something that's still to be determined, and you're right, the way that the proposal is suggested is that the measures will be chosen just based on stock status, but that doesn't need to be the only consideration. So this is the starting point that we're working with, and then the FMAT and PDT is going to think about, do other things need to be pulled in? Do the management measures at each step need to be associated with an expected level of catch or harvest? And we have already talked about there might need to be some tweaks to the accountability measures. I mean, at the end of the day, we're still required under the Magnuson Act to have an ACL and accountability associated with that. So these are things that we're going to work through, but the goal is generally to try not to be so focused on just expected harvest compared to the RHL or the ACL because of concerns with, you know, the MRIP data and how you appropriately use the MRIP data, concerns about things that have happened in the past, where, you know, we maybe in our measures haven't considered stock status, and we've maintained good stock status for some of these species anyway. So those are all things that are going to be considered, but we do need to consider how does the Magnuson Act requirements for ACLs fit into all of this. So I think I'll leave it at that, but others can chime in if there's anything else important related to that that needs to be added.
Does anybody else have anything they want to offer to the question? Okay, let's go ahead and move on then. Let's see, Dewey just put his hand down. Let's go back to the top of the list. We'll go to Tom Foti, Eric Reed, and Kate Wilkie. Go ahead, Tom.
I forgot to put my hand down.
Okay, thank you. Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So there are other fisheries in New England that use harvest control rules. Those are commercial fisheries. And I'm looking at this conceptual idea, but X and Y, neither of them ever equals 0. I'm used to seeing Y equals 0 way before X is a negative number. Usually X is some slightly positive number and Y is 0. Is this control rule going to maintain neither X nor Y at 0? Is that the intent? And my second question is, so if I look at your timeline, as far as recreational reform, the only product we're going to get between now and the end of this year is going to be the harvest control rule. Am I understanding that correctly? Thank you.
Hey, I can try and take a stab at this one. So for your second question, based on the priorities outlined by the council and the policy board, and as well as staff time constraints, this is probably going to be the only product we're going to have by December in terms of recreational reform. But in terms of your question about zero, we would never have a total recreational closure in relation to this product. That's another topic that the PET and FMAT are going to need to discuss, is how species under a rebuilding plan come into play during the harvest control rule. And I see Tony's hand is up if there's something that she would like to add.
I just want to add to that, Eric, I think that there were several things that were outlined that could be done through sort of like a technical guidance document that we had been talking about, things like looking at outliers and how you are, it was when we were doing the averaging and outlier years. And some of that stuff I think will be resolved through the harvest control rule process, or if the harvest control rule process is adopted, would take away the need to resolve some of those issues. So while this would be, you know, this was made the priority by the board and council, it does take care of some of the additional issues. I don't have them all up in front of me.
Okay, well, thanks for that back and forth. Eric, did you have a follow-up? Your hand's still up?
No, I'm all set, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Eric. All right, let's go to Kate Wilkie, and then I have a question for staff after Kate, and then I'm going to turn to Mike Pentney, who has some direction to offer at that time. So go ahead, Kate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I understand it, this rec reform initiative has been evolving since 2018 or possibly longer, but and there's been a lot of discussion and work since that time. And Julia told us a little bit about some of the history in the beginning of her presentation. But right now for rec reform, we have a list of topics that are in a table, and we have 3 bullets that describe a vision. But I don't think that all managers and stakeholders have the same understanding of what those 3 bullets mean and the full scope of the problems that we're trying to address. So in my opinion, it's what's overdue is a scoping period or a scoping document or PID to kick off a structured scoping process to get some input from the public. And I think I heard in Tom Fode's comment, you know, when are you going to go out to the public? And I know I heard that in Dewey's comments. And so the focus of the harvest control rule, the focus on the harvest control rule, that's one piece of rec reform. And so, and I have heard others mention that it may pull in some of the other issues that are coming up. And so I would like, I would hope that the FMAT and the PDT would consider how the control rule would help constrain rec catches to RHLs and how accountability measures for overages might be employed. But overall, I would just like to have a much clearer idea of the problems that we're trying to solve, and get a better understanding of the goals and the vision for the process. So, you know, maybe the harvest control rule can go out to the public sooner rather than later. So those are my comments. I hope they make sense. It's the end of a really long day, but this is a very important issue that I know a lot of people have some concerns about. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kate, and I appreciate your thoughts and comments. I think that's all something that I think your thoughts are things that need to evolve in this process. And you are right. This is very important. I do, it is late in the day, but sometimes you have to work late in the day, and this is important. I hope everybody can focus and be part of this discussion because of the importance of it. And but I appreciate your comments and thoughts, and hopefully at some point, in the near future, we will be able to take some of this out to the public. I believe, in my opinion, I think there needs to be a little bit more structure to it, as far as maybe some ideas on alternatives, maybe alternative sets that would be part of this action, so that we can get some feedback regarding the kind of the vision of where this harvest control rule could play a role in recreational management. So I'll stop there. Let me go to Rick Bellavance, and then we'll see what the next steps might be. Go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Julia. Thanks, Savannah, for your presentation. I find myself agreeing with a lot of the previous commenters in regards to getting input from the general public and stakeholders. But I am curious if the FMAT or the working group has given any consideration to a starting point of regulations that would fit on each one of those steps that we saw in your graph that you put up, for some reference to provide to the public prior to them getting a stab at offering their input. Because I think of the current regulations that we have in the Northeast, and probably a lot of recreational anglers would consider that about as undesirable as you could get. And I don't know where the room to move up would be, but I'm not really sure. So I'm just curious if the FMAT has kind of, or the working group is kind of thought in there, just as a baseline of what might be appropriate for each one of those steps, if they've done that. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick, for that question. That is a good one. The PDT and FMAT have not started looking at specifics when it comes to what management measures be at each step. And that is something that we hope to be discussing here very soon. And that's another component that we want to look at and take into consideration. If we're going to do regional steps, they're going to be coastwide, state by state, what those measures look like, and trying to find a good recommendation based on some empirical data and public input. So there's a lot still to be developed there. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does answer my question. Thanks. I just would offer that I would recommend the sooner the better on that one. Thank you.
All right, thanks for that question. All right, one last comment question from Dewey. I have a question for staff, and then we're going to see what others have to offer as far as some direction and guidance to staff on development of the harvest control rule. Let's go to Dewey next, and then I'm going to offer some comments or I have a question, and then we'll step into the next step here. Go ahead, Dewey.
Thank you. Can you put the slide back up with the initiative? Yeah, the goal part right there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dewey. So I have one question for staff in the development of this as you're working towards so we've got the harvest control model, and I think it's pretty straightforward. It's kind of a stair-step approach in determining measures that would be applied to the recreational fishery. But are there any regional differences that are being considered? There are some pretty extreme differences between the measures that are in place when you consider maybe southern New England and the southern states, below New Jersey, or maybe even including New Jersey on some of the different species that we're talking about here. I think that, what what certain, and I'm not picking on anybody, but I'm saying, you know, what might work for fishermen in New York as a very liberal fishery under good biomass and decent trends in abundance. The season and bag limit for what fishermen in New York could tolerate might be completely different from what would be acceptable for states in the South, like Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. And I just like to understand whether or not some of the regionality and the differences between the regions are they being talked about at all, or is that something that we need to fold into this discussion?
Hey, Mike, I'm happy to answer that one. So regionality is something that is being considered. I don't have any firm discussion points or answers for you on how that will be incorporated exactly, but it is a large topic of discussion that we've had between the work group and the FMAP PDT. So that is something that is being discussed, yes.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Savannah. I appreciate that. I think it's something that definitely needs to be considered as we move forward, because the regions have such differences in their measures at this point that I think it needs to be something that's included in the discussion. So thank you all very much for that back and forth with questions and answers. I'm going to let me go to the public, see if anyone has any questions. Greg DiDomenico. Go ahead, Greg. If you're speaking, Greg, we can't hear you. You're probably on mute.
Mike, can you hear me?
Now we can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. Wait a minute. Now I've got. Hold on a second. Go to the next person, Mike, please. I don't want to waste your time. I'll be back.
All right, Greg. Thanks. Anyone else from the audience, from the public? All right, Mike's got his hand up. Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear. Go ahead.
Okay, fine. I really had two questions. I'd like to understand how this whole initiative is going to take into account the fact that MRIP is going to stop publishing any stats that have a PSC of over 50%. It strikes me, especially from Tony's remarks, that we may be working on a problem that no longer exists.
I can take this one. So there are plans for, I'm not sure exactly when this is going to happen, but at some point in the near future, there'll be changes to the data that's available on the like the public data download websites through MRIP, but all of the data that's currently available will still be available by request. So if we need to, we'll be able to request that data as staff, and we don't think that there are going to be really any necessary changes to anything that we currently do or that we plan to do based on how MRIP plans to change in terms of what's publicly available for their data, because we can still put in requests to get all of the data that we're using currently.
Can I do a follow-up on that? I mean, I understand what you're saying, Tony, but I would really suspect that anytime you use a statistic that has a PSC over 50% that's not available to the public, you're going to be facing a lawsuit from one of the conservation groups.
All right, I appreciate your thoughts, Michael. Thank you very much. Greg DiDomenico, are you ready to come back?
Thank you, Mike. Can you hear me now?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. I think I have one quick question. So will the harvest control rule only be applied to whatever allocation for a particular species that the recreational industry gets?
I guess I'll take this one too. I think it's still to be determined how this ties in with the allocations. And I know this is something that the council and board are very interested in. And because the overarching goal is to move away from setting measures based strictly on an RHL or an ACL, it might look different in the future, you know, how the ACL plays into things. So I think that's still something that we're working through, and we might consider different options for you know, how that's worked in terms of if it's the way this proposal is put forward is we're not using an ACL or an RHL and in terming picking the measure steps, but we still need an ACL. So we need to tie it in somewhere. So we could consider different ways of doing that in terms of if measures are more strictly tied to an ACL or more strongly based on stock status. So that's still all to be determined. And at this point in time, we don't have a you know, we can't say that like this is exactly how it'll tie into the allocations because we're still working through the details and how strictly this needs to be tied to a catch limit. But those are all things that are going to be under consideration. I wish I could provide more concrete, satisfying answers for a lot of these questions, but these are a lot of things that the FMAT and PDT are going to work through over the coming months.
So Julia, just one quick question. The harvest control rule will only apply to the recreational sector.
Oh, yeah. Sorry if I misunderstood that part of the question. This is basically only considering how we come up with the recreational bag size and season limits each year. It's not meant to change how we come up with the ACL or how we come up with the RHL. It's not meant to impact the commercial fishery at all or the ABC at all. It's just how do we come up with the bag size and season limits each year, and how closely is that tied to the RHL or to something like stock condition or something else. It's really just focused on the bag size and season limits in the recreational fishery.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Greg, for your question. Julia, thanks for the answer. Anyone else from the audience before I come back to the table? Okay. Greg, I see your hand still up, but I'll assume that you've had your question answered at this point. All right, so we're going to come back to the council and the policy board for this discussion to continue. As I mentioned earlier, I've had some offline discussions with folks, with Mike Pentney. I hate to put him on the spot at this point, but given the hour of the day and the amount of time we've put in here discussing things today, I'm going to turn to Mike Pentney. He had some ideas about providing some guidance for continued development based on the timeline that was presented earlier. And Mike has some thoughts about putting a little bit more structure around the development of some ideas regarding the harvest control rule. So I'm going to turn to Mike at this point to provide those thoughts. And Mike, you're up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just lowering my hand so it didn't stay up there longer than it needed to. So yeah, I mean, I've been talking with my team a lot about the opportunity that recreational reform provides for stepping back from how we're currently managing the recreational fishery, looking at some new approaches, trying to think outside the box and be as creative as possible. And I think that's what's driven a lot of the work that's happened over the last couple of years with the working group and involvement from our team in that, with leadership from the council and the commission, to try to think creatively and come up with some new approaches that you know, achieve the mandate of the Magnuson Act, which to me is twofold: is prevent overfishing and ensure accountability, but also provide some opportunities for some stability in the recreational fishing measures that we implement on a year-to-year basis, and have those measures more directly linked to stock status and changes in that stock status that are important, and less driven by the variability of MRIP estimates and the general accepted uncertainty in those estimates. I've also, as you know, if you've been listening to me over the last 6 months or so, when this issue has come up, as I've tried to convey a sense of urgency for making significant progress as quickly as possible on the recreational reform initiative, so that we can, as quickly as possible, come up with some new solutions and strategies to avoid any significant, disruptions in recreational fishing that would be required under the current management model that we have, given some of the data that we're seeing out of the last couple of years. So I really encourage the council and the board to prioritize rec reform. As you know, we had a lengthy discussion at the last meeting about doing that. Appreciate that a lot of staff, the commission, the council, and my staff are working towards that end. But I'm still somewhat concerned that, especially given the timeline that was presented at the end of the presentation, I don't see an end in sight for this work, and that leaves me somewhat concerned for how we're going to deal with 2022. So in thinking about where we are in the process and accepting the group's focus on the harvest control rule as kind of the thing to really focus on now, I started thinking about the harvest control rule a little bit more and talking with staff about it. And, I think we all can agree, those of us that have looked at it, that there's two aspects to the harvest control rule concept. There's how you define the steps, which is the first piece, and the slide on the board shows the 4 stair steps there. So how do you what factors do you consider to determine whether you're in step A or step B or step D? And then the second piece is, once you know what step you're in, what measures are the ones that you would implement, and those are going to vary whether you're talking, depending on whether you're talking about black sea bass or fluke or scup, and they're going to be driven not only by the species, but also by the conditions that determined what step you're in. In other words, if your conditions for step A in one approach might be different than your conditions in step A for a different approach, then the measures that would be appropriate in step A could differ because what drove your definition of step A is different. Hopefully that's making some sense. And I'm saying that from the context of, if we think about a normal framework adjustment, which this will all eventually be, I would expect there to be a number of alternatives, different approaches for how we define the steps. And alternatives A, B, C, and D for how we define those steps. There's a lot of ideas that the FMAT, the PDT have been talking about, the working group, a lot of ideas we might get from the recreational fishing industry and others for how we define those steps. And those could sort of coalesce into several different alternatives that we would consider in a framework document. And then there would also need to be a set of alternatives under the second piece, which is what management measures apply in each step. And those could vary, again, based on which alternative we're talking about in the first piece. So this is kind of overwhelming if you start thinking about that this all needs to be developed into a framework document at some point, hopefully towards the end of 2021. So in trying to cut to the chase a little bit and talking with staff about a possible way to help push this forward, I'm prepared to make a motion. And Mr. Chairman, if you would prefer to this not be in the form of a motion, that's your prerogative. But I do have a motion, I believe, queued up with staff. And it's really an alternative.
Yeah. So Mike, in discussion with leadership, both at the commission and with council, we're meeting jointly right now with the policy board. We haven't really decided how we're going to move as far as motions go with the policy board at this time. We weren't expecting, until you and I spoke earlier this week, there was no expectation that there would be motions made. So what I think would be best here would be if you could explain your rationale as to your idea here, and maybe we can reach consensus both on behalf of the council and the policy board in moving forward with this as one of the alternative sets that would be part of the document.
Yep.
I think that instead of making a motion, I'd like to get a couple questions and comments and see if we can just reach consensus on moving forward in this direction, rather than voting on it at this time. So
All right,
I'll stop there and let you explain what it is that you've presented to staff.
All right, fair enough, Mr. Chairman. So I will run through this not in the form of a motion, but in the form of a suggestion for a path forward. And I'll mention that this only addresses how you define the steps piece, recognizing that the measures that would apply in each step are going to be species dependent, and they're going to be somewhat complicated. And I think that the PDT and the FMAT, is the right group to really think through and develop some options for the management measures that would apply in each step. But what I'm trying to do here is throw an approach, and I'm stressing the "and" because I think there ultimately should be several different approaches that the council and the board consider as part of the harvest control rule for how we define the steps. But to me, this is a relatively straightforward, somewhat simple, but meaningful approach that gets to what we're trying to achieve in the sense of defining steps that reflect the status of the stock, that then inform what management measures we should be using for the recreational fishery each year. And so I'm just going to read what's up on the board, and people can follow along. And this isn't in the form of a motion, so it just reads, the council and board include in the recreational reform initiative action, leaving that to be determined, an alternative that defines the conditions for setting management measures, which is the steps, based on two factors and only two factors: stock status, which would be the biomass relative to the BMSY or proxy. So that gives you three places you can be: healthy, rebuilding, or overfished. And then also the most recent trend in biomass, which would be either increasing, stable, or decreasing. And when you plot those out as a 3x3 matrix, you get this little table here. And that you could end up with 9 steps. What I've tried to do is condense those 9 steps in a 3x3 down to 6, which I think is the more reasonable way. And you can see that when you have a healthy stock, that is, the stock is above B target, you can be a little more liberal, and you can treat a stable stock above B target the same as an increasing stock. So that's step A. But when the stock is below B target, either because it's overfished or it's rebuilding, you err a little bit more precautionary, and you treat stable the same as decreasing. So you're a little bit more precautionary. So that's how you condense down to 6 steps. So ideally in this scenario, I hope it's obvious, step A is the place you want to be. You want to have a healthy stock that's above B target, that's either stable or increasing. The place you want to avoid at all costs is step F, which would be an overfished stock that's below B threshold and either stable or decreasing, that is not rebuilding, not recovering. So the most restrictive measures would be down in step F. And I'll note that under the council's risk policy, a stock that is at less than 10% of BMSY, you would have 0 harvest. So it's sort of inherent or implicit in the council's risk policy would be a complete prohibition on harvest for stocks below 10%. That would be included as part of step F. But if you're not that low, you might have some other very restrictive measures. And then step A obviously is where you want to be. So those are the least restrictive measures that provide the most opportunity for fishing. So I've defined my terms there under the where. So healthy, stock above B target, rebuilding between B threshold and B target, regardless of whether the stock's in a formal rebuilding plan or not. Overfished, the stock is below B threshold, the stock is considered overfished. And then for increasing, stable, or decreasing, I've sort of thrown an example up there. We might use a 3-year average biomass estimate. And I sort of did an X% because you might want to put some error bars around that. So you're not changing from increasing to stable or decreasing on a whim. It's if you've increased more than 3%, then that's increasing or so forth. And then I just kind of define step A, step B through E, and step F, as I already discussed. So the intent here is that if this is accepted by the council and the board as an alternative, an approach for defining the measures, then I think that would accomplish a couple things. One is hopefully it provides a little bit more clarity to some people who are looking at this harvest control rule rec reform initiative and are still trying to figure out exactly how it would be used and how stock status would inform our decision about what step we're in. Hopefully this does that for one approach. And again, it's not the only approach. There might be other factors that people suggest we should use. But then also it might help give the PDT and the FMAT a little direction for, okay, take this as an example alternative, and then go off and develop some proposed management measures that would apply in each of those six steps for one or two of the species that are the subject of the action. And if they're able to do that and come back to us in August with some more concrete examples of what the measures might look like, then hopefully that will sort of promote the conversation and the discussion around other alternatives and how those other alternatives might look in terms of setting management measures. And then that, will eventually, hopefully, form the foundation for a framework adjustment on the council side and an addendum on the commission side, the board side, that we can make real progress on later this year. So I think I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman. I've said a lot. There may be some questions out there, so hopefully I can try to address the questions. I will say, sort of, as a caveat, I don't expect to have all the answers. This is just one approach. I think there are others that people might have. So don't look at this as the only way forward for rec reform or for the harvest control rule, but look at this as a starting point for a conversation around some other ways we could do this and how this way and other possible ways might inform the management measures that we would utilize through rec reform and the harvest control rule. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Mike. And, I think that's where we are. I mean, I appreciate the work that you put in working with your staff and others to develop something like this as a starting point for the consideration of an alternative. I think you put the work in. Your description was well stated, and we are at the point where this is new to everybody, and I think you've provided a strong alternative to be considered, to be developed. And like you said, you don't have all the answers at this point, but it's something to start with rather than continuing down the path of questions related to where we're going to go next. So I appreciate you spending the time giving that description to all of us here today. I assume there's going to be a couple questions. If I would like to focus at this point on what Mike's presented as a step moving forward, and I'm going to go to Tony DeLernia for comments or questions. Go ahead, Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the regional administrator did a very, very good job of describing how we should be going forward. To me, it was intuitive that this is how we will go all along. But clearly, I guess for some, it needed to be laid out in this matrix that he has here. And this is exactly what I had in mind. And I think I want to thank the regional administrator for laying it out this way. And I think it's a very good way to go. And I support that approach completely. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tony. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd like to ask or comments? Dr. Rago.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I just want to offer, I do think Mike has, laid out an important dimension to this by including the information related to the trend in the stock as an important part, as well as its status. One thing I would just offer is that perhaps another dimension too is to take some note of the idea of risk, in the sense that when you have sort of these discontinuities between sets of measures that might be applied to the resource, what you are assuming is that when you are on the within any given system status, any step, you're assuming that the same measures are applied when the stock is on the right-hand side of the step as opposed to the left-hand side of the step. However, during that period, the risk to the resource is increasing. So as you move from the high end of healthy status to the low end of healthy status, you have the same measures being applied, and that those could in fact be resulting in a higher risk to the resource. So just like, you know, discontinuities in the tax code result in different behaviors, you could be inducing similar types of changes in risk as you move from one step to another. And when you hit that boundary, you're going to have some major, you know, changes that are induced that may be as unpleasant as sort of the continuous changes that you're trying to avoid. So, but I think that this is a step forward, and appreciate the enhancement. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul, for those comments. Dr. Duvall, you're up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just really echoing Tony's comments from earlier. I do I appreciate the work that Mr. Pantney's put into this. You know, I do think it provides an alternative that the FMAT and the PDT can move forward with to sort of, you know, hang some meat on the bones of this concept. And I think that's going to be really important with respect to, you know, going out to the public and at least having, you know, not just for the public, but also for council members and commission members to have a better sense of the utility of this type of approach and, you know, where it might need to be tweaked, or, you know, as the FMAT and PDT work through something like this, you know, perhaps other factors and other approaches, as Mike alluded to, will reveal themselves. So I definitely support moving forward with this as one type of approach. Thanks.
I appreciate that, Michelle. Is there anybody else that would like to offer any comment or have any questions for Mr. Pantney regarding his presentation of this alternative? Eric Reed. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what's the action here that we approve going forward with this by consent, which I would be willing to support a consensus statement to that effect.
Yeah, I wanted to get a couple questions answered, and then I basically was going to ask if there's any objection in moving forward. I didn't want to do this as a motion, but more of an idea that would be presented to the FMAT and the PDT as they work through this. Something to kind of give them a backstop to start working on, rather than just being all theoretical. It kind of provides a basis for further discussions and, you know, puts a little bit of meat on the bones. I don't know if that's the right analogy, but you know, that's kind of how I see it at this point. You okay with that, Eric?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. All right, I'm going to go to Dewey, then Tom Foti, and then I'm going to ask for support to see whether or not the council and the policy board agree that this is something that can move forward for further development. So go ahead, Dewey, you're up next.
Could we get this sent to us?
Of course.
So I can digest it some more. I'm having a hard time kind of understanding. I'm kind of trying to have a hard time understanding the concept here, but that's to be expected. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we can certainly make this available. If it's something that is moved forward, I can have Chris send it out, and Bob can send it out to the policy board as well. But if it's not approved, if it's not something that the board and the council want to move forward with, then, you know, there's no sense in sending it around. But I would like to see it go out. I'd like to see this be something that's developed, and then we can make sure everybody gets a copy of it so you can digest it. And then if Mike, I'm sure Mike would be happy to answer questions, outside of the council meeting, one-on-one if need be, on how things would work. So
Yeah, can I ask just one more question with this?
Sure.
When I'm looking at this, so would the level of catch could increase or decrease based on the biomass trend? Is that what this is saying, or the formula for looking at how to do this?
Yeah, it's kind of a double. There's two parts to it. It's biomass, and it's also trend. So it's a combination of the two factors. So if biomass is high and healthy, and there's an increasing and stable population over time, you'd be at you'd have liberal measures applied, which is what Mike explained as far as step A. And if the biomass is low and you have decreasing, even if they're stable, but if the biomass is low and you're overfished, you're going to have more restrictive measures there. So it's not only just biomass, but it's also trend that would be playing a part in this.
Well, how do you control effort that takes out of this biomass? How does that work?
Well, I think that's where the measures go into place. So with each step, there would be different recreational measures that would accompany where we are within the steps, but that is yet to be developed. That is something that staff, the FMAT, the PDT would have to start thinking about as far as what those measures would be to constrain the fishery to maintain that healthy stock status and that increasing or stable population size over time. What would those measures be? And under an overfish status, if you're in step F, you're going to have much more restricted measures, but there's going to be a point for which those restrictive measures might be too much for the industry, recreational industry, to handle. And so you kind of have to, that's where the further development of this becomes important as the PDT and FMAT discuss what those measures are going to be. Does that make sense, Dewey?
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dewey. Tom Fody?
Yeah, Mike, both Mikes. I think we've been sitting around here since about 9 o'clock this morning. And I really was up since 4 o'clock this morning because I had to do something at 5. So I'm a little tired and I'm not ready to really approve something, or I have no problem forwarding something that I just seen at 6 o'clock at night after sitting on the computer for 9 hours straight. I haven't even had trouble reading because my eyes are blurring so much. So I really like the opportunity to look at this document, send it out to us, and then basically have another meeting to decide what we do with it. I'm not ready to sign on to anything without having some thorough analysis and look at it. And I'm not tonight. I'm just not in best of shape to do that. I've made some bad decisions by sitting at meetings at 9:30 at night or 8 o'clock after going for 12 hours straight. So I'm not comfortable doing that tonight.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Tom. And like you, I mean, I'm tired too. We've all had a long day. I don't think there's anything here, honestly. I'll just provide you my thought. I don't think there's anything here that is going to turn into something that the board and the policy board and the council aren't going to have another look at. I mean, obviously, this is a step in moving forward. The whole point of Mike bringing this up, and Mike, I don't want to speak for you, but the conversation that we had, the delay, if we delay this until the next meeting we have in August, it's just a further delay of any detail within this harvest control rule concept. And therefore, this is just a concept at this point. And I personally think that we should allow for the PDT and FMAT to take this concept that was developed by the regional administrator and begin to work on it and provide us a feedback as to what they come up with based on this concept. And so Tom, I don't know that we don't need to we're not approving anything at this point. This is not the end all be all. This is not where we end up at the end of the day. It's just an idea to move forward and keep things moving, keep the ball rolling forward. So I'll leave it at that and call on Dan Farnham. He's got his hand up. Dan, did you have a question or comment?
Just a quick comment, Mr. Chairman. I totally agree with your statement there to move forward with this concept and not delay any longer. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, we're not deciding on anything today. We're looking at, steps moving forward. That's really all it boils down to, in my opinion. And Mike's done a nice job of laying it out. We can certainly get it out to the board members and the council members so you can digest it a little bit more as it develops. But I think it's a good step forward. Anyone else have any thoughts on this before I ask for possibly a consensus? I'd rather not do this in the form of a motion because it could we could go down a rabbit hole that has no end to it. Tom, your hand's still up. Did you have any follow up, or did you? Can you put if you don't, please put your hand down.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how we should do this tonight. With we didn't see this before. It was not sent out to us before the meeting to even look at. And again, it might be a perfectly good document, but I can't really have a hard time focusing on it right now at 6:30 at night. And I'm just saying we could let people look at it, send it to, but I'm not ready to give it any kind of endorsement or anything else. It just says move forward, let more eyes at it, and then I'll give more eyes to it and start looking at it with other people that I know.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, Tom, but looking at this document, there really isn't anything to it. What we need is for the PDT and the FMAT to take this concept and work on it and provide us feedback as to how they see this coming to, elevating itself to the point where the harvest control rule might work under this. So I think a delay of a few months is not warranted in this case. If you and I could sit here, you could read this 15 times and there's really not a lot to it. I mean, it's a concept, and I would prefer that we support that concept and allow for some development to happen and then get some feedback in August based on the PDT and FMAT's work to try to develop this concept. And then if we don't like it, then we could say, all right, put a hold on it for a while, put a hold. We're not going to move forward in this direction anymore. But really, honestly, I don't know what we get out of a couple more months of just sitting on this, one pager from the regional administrator. I think this is something that we should support. Let staff work on it and then get some feedback. So that's my opinion. I try not to be too opinionated, but in this case, I think that's where we are. And I know it's late in the day. I know people are tired. I do want to wrap up relatively soon. I'm kind of focused on 7 o'clock as a hard stop on this discussion, which is about 20 minutes from now. So just if you guys can just hang in there, be patient. We're going to get through it. And but this is important information. We've been working on it for a long time, and I do want to see it through. So I've got two staff members, both Tony Kearns and Chris Moore, have their hands up. Let me go to Tony first, and then Chris, I'll come down to you, and then Tony Delarney, I'll end with you. Go ahead, Tony Kearns.
Mr. Chair, just really quickly, if it gives board members or council members any more reassurance, we are happy to take the PDT, and I assume the FMAT is happy to take any kind of suggestions that you have, either at a meeting or in an email to myself, Savannah, or Julia along the way. If you can think about this more, if you have other ideas to this issue, and that the PDT might even develop other steps, a different option for steps. So it's not the only thing that you will see in the future.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tony. And you're right. Yeah, this is just a starting point. So we can see how it develops. Chris Moore, did you have something to offer?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just quickly, I think, I understand Tom's point to some extent, but I think you also need to understand, Tom, you also need to understand that the FMAT and the PDT are already working on this. So this is specific guidance being provided by NIMS that could help with their work. So I think we're in a good spot. I think that from my perspective, this is something that that we can take a look at through the FMAT and PDT and provide an update in August to the council and the policy board. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Let's see. Tony and Chris, Tony Kearns and Chris, can you put your hands down? Tom Fody, your hand's still up. If you can put that down at this point. I want to make sure I've got the people who want to speak to this. Let me go to Tony Delernia next, and then I have Kate Wilkie and Adam Nowalski, and then we're gonna start to wrap this up. So go ahead, Tony Delernia.
Yeah, my suggestion would be to take this slide, copy it, send it out to all the council members, commission members, and let them have some offline discussions if they wish, so that they're prepared to look at this when it comes back in August. Regional administrator is right. We have to get moving on this, and I'm glad he put this out the way he did. And if we're gonna get things done for December, we gotta keep moving on it. So I understand how Fody is coming from. So the best way to do it is just copy the slides, send it out to everybody, have folks to have some offline discussions, and then when you come back in August, everybody's ready to talk about it. Thanks.
Yeah, I feel the same way, Tony. But in order for us to come back in August to discuss it, we need to be supportive of the concept at this point. And I think, your point's well taken. We can get this out. People can talk about it. Staff can work on it. And as Chris Moore said, they're already working on it, but this gives a little different guidance as to how to establish these steps and possible measures. And so, I think the right path is to let this slide forward, and we'll get some feedback in August. Kate Wilkie, I've got you next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I was going to ask, can the PDT and FMAT just move forward and look at this without an endorsement by the council and the board today? Because I think what I'm hearing is just discomfort with endorsing this idea when we haven't really been able to digest it, and we're all kind of cross-eyed at this point. And so that's my question to you. Do we have to provide an endorsement today? It wasn't even part of the meeting materials. And I am supportive of, I'm glad that the regional administrator is throwing out an idea to kind of get the ball rolling, but I think I'm hearing discomfort from folks endorsing today.
I'm sorry, Kate, you cut off at the last second. What was your last point?
I just said that I thought I was hearing discomfort with folks giving an endorsement at this point without fully digesting.
And are you on that camp?
Honestly, I don't know what to think. Because I do see how sometimes things discussed at a meeting, like suddenly all of a sudden they become the snowball that then we are moving in that direction. And so what I was asking for earlier was kind of more going out to the public and getting more ideas rather than limiting ourselves to, one or two proposals that just happen to kind of get on the radar of the PDT and the FMAT. So, I don't have, I also am cross-eyed at this time. So, those are my comments. And
okay, no, I appreciate it. I don't want to keep belaboring the same point. But there is a time sensitivity here to some degree. For a couple years now, we have been postponing changes to the recreational management measures under the current guidelines for a number of different reasons. And this was one of the ways that we were hoping recreational reform was kind of hoping to get us out of the box a little bit. I hope that the folks around the table aren't terribly concerned that this is going to be the end-all be-all stepwise procedure that is going to take shape and become the new way we manage recreational fisheries. I think going to the public with something more solid as an alternative is a lot better than going forward with some kind of concept and just getting random thoughts about how we could do things better. In my mind, it's better to go forward with something that maybe we have supported for further development, and we'll see what comes of it. That's kind of where I am at this point on this issue. Adam Nowalski, I've got you next, and we'll go to Bob. I do want to start wrapping things up here, folks. It is getting late. I know everybody's tired. So let's go to Adam and then Bob, and then I have Michelle and Eric. Adam, you're up.
Yeah, we started with a good morning, made it into a good afternoon, and now we're on to good evening. So I appreciate the efforts here of staff, the FMAT PDT that's been formed. A lot of those people have been part of the staff people working on this. A partner in this has been the service, Mr. Petney in particular, providing his staff with the ability to take part in these discussions, and I very much appreciate the very discreet idea that has been brought forward here. With regards to some of the concerns I've had about a public, I think it's important to remember that the impetus for some harvest control rule-like approach came from the public over a year and a half ago. Rec reform has not been a private process. It's been very public. Over the course of the allocation amendment development, opportunities for public comment brought something forward that was ultimately moved into a rec-only perspective. FMAT PDT meetings going forward are posted on the Mid-Atlantic website. They are an open public process, not only to just the public if they want to participate or listen in, but as well as other council and commission members. So I understand that this is coming at 6:45 here at night for a lot of people, but I'm very comfortable, and I've been one of the most vocal opponents to things happening behind a curtain, a strong advocate for transparency. I'm getting a lot of echo. I'll try again. Yeah, I don't know if that's on my end or somebody else.
Adam, I can't tell where it's coming from. But if everyone can check their mute buttons to make sure you're on mute, that would be helpful.
So, all right, we'll try this again. So I appreciate, again, the effort here. I have shared similar concerns about the progress that we've been making. I've worked with some staff on another idea. I think we've been in fisheries management for 4+ decades from the initial Magnuson Act that has really got us all in the mindset of let's divide this up and fight for every last fish that we need to and claim it as our own. I would like to think we've moved to a point beyond that. The harvest control rule approach proposes an element of the most liberal measures that the recreational sector would need, regardless of how low that allocation percent might be. Let's find a use for it. Let's find an efficient use for commercial fishermen to make use of recreational fish that is needed beyond a liberal set of measures. Let's find ways to decrease imports of fish in the the United States and continue to feed the country with a sustainable source. So those are all tenets of this that I support. I think at this point, with what I'm hearing from people, trying to put another picture of another idea is probably not a beneficial way forward here this evening. I think what's important for people here at this point to know is that I don't think you're looking for tonight anyone to approve this as an alternative. I think all you're looking for at this point is to say, we're putting this out there. We intend to forward it to the PDT and FMAT to look at it. If somebody objects, then quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, I am prepared to make a motion to move this forward if we can't just get a consensus to allow the PDT to look at this, to give it consideration and thought about how to move it forward, with the expectation that those FMAT PDT meetings would be public, that this will come back to us at a future meeting, at which point we would decide how to use it. If we don't, we are quite frankly potentially looking at a crisis for 2022 with management. The regional director has made it very clear we need to have progress. This is progress that supports the work that's already been done. Tony Kearns offered the ability to input other ideas. I'll take advantage of that and bring that forward. Welcome involvement from other council members, commissioners, the public to reach out to me to talk more about it, to review it through the FMAT process. But again, I think at this point, either we've got a consensus that we can let the FMAT and the PDT look at this, knowing it's going to come back to us, and if we can't get that consensus, Mr. Chairman, then I'll make a motion. We've been talking about this for a half hour. I hope we can limit debate on that and just move this forward one way or the other. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Adam. And so at this point, I am going to cut off discussion. We've had plenty of discussion about this. I think one of the important points to all of this is that by supporting moving forward with this, you're not necessarily endorsing it as an alternative, but you're supporting the further development of the concept. I think there's a difference there. You could go back to your stakeholders and say that you supported the further development of something, but you don't necessarily have to endorse it as something that you would like to see in a management document. So that point, I wanted to stress that point. And so what I'm going to do, I'm sorry, Bob and Eric, but I am going to cut this conversation off. I'd like to ask both members of the policy board and the council if there's anybody who objects to further development of this concept with the PDT and the FMAT for a review and update at an upcoming meeting, so that we can kind of take a hard look at how this develops through that process. Is there any objection to that? Okay, seeing no objection, and with the understanding that by not objecting, you're not necessarily endorsing anything, you're just accepting the fact that this will be further developed as presented by Mr. Pentney, and staff will take this under their wing and move forward with further development for a future update presentation to both the policy board and the council. Okay, that's how I see this taking place. Is there anything else that needs to come before this joint body at this time under recreational reform? Okay, seeing no hands, I want to thank all of you for your patience today. It was a very long day. We got a lot of good work done. I think this kind of caps it off. I believe that this is a good process moving forward. So thank you all for your time and your patience as we worked late into the evening. Hopefully all of you will be able to go enjoy your evenings and have a nice dinner and sit back and relax a little bit. So I will say that this meeting of the joint body between the policy board and the Mid-Atlantic Council is now adjourned, and the Mid-Atlantic Council will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And we have a full plate tomorrow as well. So thank you all again. We are adjourned, and enjoy your evenings. And I'll be back online at 9 o'clock tomorrow to talk with all of you. Thank you. Take care, everybody.